Today we're going to learn what to do with all of these infinitives that we've been studying. And the main thing that we're going to do with them is that we're going to use them in something that is called indirect statement. So let's get started. The first thing we need to talk about is the difference between direct speech and indirect speech. So, for example, direct speech would be Elvis is here. That is just a statement of fact if Elvis is in the building. Elvis is here. But an example of indirect speech would be to say, he says that Elvis is here. So you can see that what we've done is that we have this person or individual who is using a verb of speaking or thinking, and then in English we always include this word that, and then we have what looks like our original sentence. And this is how we do it in English. Verbs that like to take an indirect statement are what we call head verbs. That is, they are verbs of saying. So he says, he tells, he narrates, he yells, he screams, he articulates, anything like that. But verbs of thinking as well, which is something that you can do with your head. Think, cogitate, muse, ponder. Verbs of seeing and perceiving, right? See, understand, hear, right? Anything like that. And verbs of knowing and reporting. So I know, I understand. All of these verbs are verbs that like to take an indirect statement, and they take it in English and they take it in Latin. If you look at the verbs that we're learning in this chapter, all of those verbs are head verbs. They are verbs that are going to want to take an indirect statement. And you can see that this kind of speech, this indirect speech or indirect statement in English, there's one sentence and then we have this word that, and then we have the original statement. And that is what shows us that we have an indirect statement in English. That's sort of one way we could tell for sure. But Latin does something else. In Latin, what Latin does is it takes that same head verb, but then the original, if we look at that original statement, the subject goes into the accusative and the verb goes into the infinitive. So you can see here, if we're translating our sentence, we would say Elvis is here. Elvis ad est, right? Elvis is here. But if we transform this into an indirect statement, we can say, here's our verb. He says, Dicket, and then our Elvis goes into the accusative, and our verb goes into the infinitive. So Elvis ad est becomes Dicket, Elwem. You can see that Elvis is, of course, belonging to the third declension. Ad est becomes ad esse. So when the first statement is put into indirect statement, the subject goes into the accusative case and the conjugated verb goes into the infinitive. And everything else in the sentence stays exactly the same. The only thing that will change is the subject goes into the accusative, the verb goes into the infinitive, but we're going to have potentially a second accusative that's our direct object. Our prepositional phrases will look exactly the same. Everything else will look exactly the same. These are the two things that change. Now, one of the things that makes Latin tricky when we're looking at these infinitives and why we had to learn all 6 of these infinitives is because we don't translate necessarily a present verb into a present infinitive or a perfect verb into a perfect infinitive, because infinitives have what we call aspect. And other verb forms also have aspect, in particular participles. And this was a conversation we postponed it having, but it's a conversation that we can have now. When we say, he says that Elvis is here, dicit elvem adesse, the tense of this infinitive is in the present, not because this is present, although it is, but it's about the relationship between these two verbs. The original verb and the conjugated verb, the verb that is triggering the indirect statement. So in Latin, the present doesn't indicate present tense. It signals that the time that's happening here and the time that's happening here are the same time. The perfect infinitive says that whatever's happening in the infinitive part of our sentence happened first. It happened before the action of the conjugated verb, of the main verb. And the future infinitive shows what's called time subsequent. That is, it's showing action that's going to happen after the time in the main verb. We haven't talked about this with participles, but participles work the same way, and I could put that here if I so chose, right? That a present participle shows action that's happening at the same time as the action of the main verb. This perfect participles show action that's happened before the time of the main verb, and the future participle shows action before, or that's going to happen after the time of the main verb. And I'm going to show you exactly how this looks and how we would translate such a situation. Okay? So here's an example, present tense. So you can see here, right, that my infinitive is the same all the way through. This is a present infinitive of ad sum, to be present, ad esse. But what changes is the tense of the main verb that's triggering our indirect statement. So, dicit elvem adesse. He says right now that Elvis is here right now. This action is happening at the same time. But I could say dixit elvem adesse. And this means that both of these things have happened in the past. He said yesterday that Elvis was here yesterday. These two things happened at the same time in the past. And if I use the future, dicet elvem adesse, he will say that Elvis is here, or we could say will be here. But the idea is that these two things are going to happen at the same time. He will say in the future, tomorrow, that Elvis will be here tomorrow. Or he will say tomorrow that Elvis is here tomorrow. The future is always the trickiest to translate because we're not very precise about the future the way that other languages sometimes are. But the most important thing to remember is not necessarily specific the best way to translate it, although if a formula like this helps you, go ahead. But remember that the present tense just shows that the thing that's happening in this part of the sentence is happening at the same time as the thing in this part of the sentence. That's what the present means. If we look at the perfect, we see something a little bit different. So here you could see I've got this new form of our infinitive. This is our perfect active infinitive, ad fuisse. right? So fui is the perfect of sum. So fuisse is our perfect active infinitive ad fuisse, to have been present. But you can see again that all of my verbs are in different tenses, and that means that this is saying that this action has happened first. So in the first example, he says right now, today, that Elvis was here. Elwem ad fuisse. Oh, it should be elwem. Look at that. So he says today that Elvis was here yesterday. Okay. This action happened before the action of the saying. He said yesterday that Elvis had been here. Dixit Elohim ad fuisse. This, because this action has to happen first, and this is already in the perfect. To get this further in the past, we have to translate it as a pluperfect, right? To get it back really far. And in the future, he will say that Elvis was here, right? That Elvis was here prior to him saying this. Okay, so again, the thing to remember is that the perfect infinitive shows that whatever happened before the action of the main verb, and that what it's showing is a time relationship. And finally, the future. The important thing to know here for these infinitives is that sum has a special future infinitive. If you haven't already learned it, it's fore, and so ad fore means will be. Okay, to be, about to be. So we'll do the exact same thing here. You can see we have different tenses of the verbs, but dicit elwem ad fore. He says right now, today, that Elvis will be here tomorrow. Dicit elwem ad fore. Or he said yesterday that Elvis would be here the next day, whenever that was, right? So this action happened after this action. Or in the future, dicet, he will say that Elvis will be here after he says this, right? So it's hard to sort of see. He will say tomorrow that Elvis will be here the day after that. Okay. So again, the future infinitive shows the time relationship, that this event, Elvis's presence, is going to happen in the future relative to the time of the main verb. Now, notice I translated this with the word would, and this is just, again, because English is really tricky in the future. So it's not, for those of you who understand subjunctives in other languages, this is not a subjunctive. This is the way that we use the future when we're talking about it in the past. Okay? So those are sort of the critical elements of indirect statement. One final thing that can get tricky in indirect statement, pronouns. So you can see here I have an original sentence. I lead the dog. Canem duco. But maybe, let's imagine there's a reason for a sentence like this. I say that I lead the dog. So dico, right, becomes my main verb. And then I have to put this into the accusative. I have to put my verb into the infinitive. So I say that I may, canem stays the same, right? That's going to be the same. And then the verb goes into the infinitive, ducere. I say that I lead the dog. Now, if I don't put the may in there, we're going to assume that it's me and that the subject of the main verb and that the subject of the infinitive are the same. That's, for the Romans, a logical assumption if you only have something that, because if I have a verb, a sentence like dico canem ducere, I say that the dog leads. You could translate it that way, but it's probably more likely that I am leading the dog. So both translations would be possible, but you can always include the may to make it really clear. So, and likewise, we're going to absolutely need it if I change this I to he. Now suddenly our subjects are different, right? He and I are not the same. He says that I lead the dog. Now the may is absolutely necessary, right? Dicit me canem ducere. Okay, so in this first one, may isn't necessary because we assume the subject is the same as dico, but here you can see I've got two accusatives. The first one is the subject, and the second one is the direct object, and it comes right before the infinitive. Okay? Now, this is pretty straightforward in a situation like this, but what if we have a sentence like, he leads the dog, right? Subject, verb, direct object. Canem ducit. If we change this to he says that he leads the dog, our problem now becomes who is he? And we have two different choices. So you can see we have dicit se canem ducit, or dicit eum canem ducit. In this, remember, se is a reflexive pronoun, so that means that this has to be the same as the subject of the main sentence. These two guys are the same. He's saying that he himself leads the dog. But it's also possible that these he's are totally different people, in which case eum refers to some other guy. Guy number one, dicit, that guy number two, eum canem ducit. Okay, so this is the difference between a reflexive pronoun. This person is the same as the subject of the main sentence of dicit, but in the case of eum, it's a different person. Okay, so let's just sum up really, okay? In English, indirect speech has the word that. It has some head verb followed by that and then a sentence. And that is the way that we know that we have an indirect statement. He thinks that you are smart. I know that it is raining. That tells us that we have indirect statement. But Latin has no that. So Latin does something else instead. It uses an accusative and an infinitive after a head verb, right? So some kind of action that your head can do, thinking, talking, perceiving, seeing, any of those kinds of activities, knowing, those are verbs that like to take an indirect statement. The infinitive will be in the present, the perfect, or the future, depending on its relationship to the main verb. If the two actions happen at the same time, we use the present. If the action in the indirect statement took place first, we use the perfect. And if the action in the indirect statement is going to happen after the action in the main verb, we use the future. The future is not terribly common. The present and the perfect are very common, and so we're going to do most of our practicing with those forms. The other thing is to remember that pronouns can be tricky, so pay attention to them. For your homework, you're going to work with transforming sentences. After a phrase, you're going to insert the phrase puella dixit, And so what you need to do is transform your sentences. You need to take the subject and put it into the accusative. You need to take your verb and put it into an infinitive, trying to think about the time relationship. And then everything else will stay the same. And we'll look at these 10 sentences in class to see how you do. Okay.